Hello viewers, I am George from Ireland, and this video is about the 1850 Compromise as part of the origins of the American Civil War, A-level history topic. To recap, this is the United States. In the mid-19th century, there were 26 states in the United States at the time, two sections, the North and the South, and they were roughly evenly balanced in terms of number of states, the North having considerably a larger population and much more industry. So the 1850 Compromise, it settled a number of issues, although it left some open. One of them was that California was admitted to the United States as a free state. Many Americans believed in manifest destiny, that the United States would expand from the Atlantic coast all the way to the Pacific, absorbing all the territory in between, taking over territory from the Native Americans, sometimes by purchase, mostly annexation. Gold had been discovered in California several years earlier. At Klondike, there had been the California Gold Rush. Anyway, California joined the United States. Texas had been a slave state for some years. Texas had also claimed New Mexico territory. Texas agreed to drop this claim and recognize that New Mexico territory was somewhat separate. Notice that at that point New Mexico was a territory, it was not a state. Quite a few American citizens lived in New Mexico. There was a possibility that New Mexico would become a state of the United States at that stage. It was not yet one, it was a territory, which meant it was a candidate to join the United States. The same went for Utah. Utah was where Mormons settled. Mormons are an unusual Christian sect. They called themselves the Church of the Latter-day Saints of Jesus Christ. Let me see. And popular sovereignty was the way of resolving this issue. Should a territorial state allow slavery or not? The people in that territorial state would decide. I say people, only white men. Obviously, black people, even free men, were not permitted the right to vote, were severely discriminated against by the laws at the time. So virulently racist attitudes were depressingly widespread amongst whites at the time. The slave trade was outlawed in Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. is the capital of the United States. For those of you who are not familiar with the geography of the United States, Washington State is not the same place as Washington, D.C. They're opposite sides of the country. In Washington, D.C., the D.C. stands for District of Columbia. The capital city, Washington, D.C., is not a state because it's got to be neutral between the states because of the federal nature of the U.S. government. As you know, the United States operates on two levels. There's a federal government to handle certain issues for the whole of the United States, and then there's the states which handle certain matters for the states themselves. In those days, the federal government had rather limited power, and the states had much more power than they do today. So although people could no longer be bought and sold in Washington, D.C., slavery still existed. If someone was brought to Washington, D.C. as a slave, he or she, unfortunately, was still kept in that state of bondage. Let me see. The other pro-slavery lobby in Congress was deeply unhappy that human beings could no longer be bought and sold in Washington, D.C. However, the abolitionists managed to win that one. Abolitionist at this time meant somebody who wanted to abolish slavery. So there was a very well-funded pro-slavery caucus because some men had grown very, very wealthy on exploiting others and treating them abysmally. The Fugitive Slave Act already existed, but it was enhanced at this time. So some slaves were courageous enough to run away from slave states and find freedom in free states. However, if these people ran away, they could be kidnapped and dragged back to face horrendous tortures and be compelled to work as slaves again. So some people in the northern states thought this was terrible, that people who had the bravery to run away were being taken back to live in this servile state. You might have seen the film 12 Years a Slave. Actually, a free black man in one of the northern states was kidnapped, brought to a southern state, and forced to be a slave. It's worth pointing out that not all African Americans were slaves at this time. Some of them had already had their right to freedom recognized. Unfortunately, most African Americans did not have their right to freedom acknowledged by their white compatriots. Let me see. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 strengthened the existing act and said that people of the northern states were required to assist in grabbing runaway slaves and helping return them to their former masters. This was very distasteful to the abolitionists in the north, as in those who wanted to abolish slavery. There were a few abolitionists in the south, but for the most part, Southerners were pro-slavery, partly because exploiting people as though they were animals was quite beneficial to the economy, not so beneficial to those who were so horrendously exploited. So what had led up to this sense that slavery had to be limited? Partly it was a famous novel called Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe, published a few years earlier, and it was one of the first novels to recognize the full humanity of people who were unlucky enough to be slaves. Uncle Tom is an elderly black man who's been promised his freedom by his master, and his master dies without having put that into the will that Uncle Tom is to be set free, and he's inherited by relatives of his former master because slaves were treated as property, just passed from one person to another in a will, and Uncle Tom has had this promise broken to him, but he accepts it very philosophically. He's magnanimous. Harriet Beecher Stowe intended him to be a fine example of Christian fortitude and forgiveness. African Americans in recent decades have seen as being feeble, as being far too forgiving, because people should hate their oppressors. And Uncle Tom is now an insult in the African American community, meaning a black person who would rather help whites than support their own race. Someone who will keep making excuse for the cruel acts committed against African Americans. Well, back to the 1850 Compromise. So it had support from people like Henry Clay of Kentucky, who was a pro-slavery person. Kentucky was just a southern state, though it was quite finely balanced between pro-slavery people and abolitionists. He would belong to the Whig Party. Senator Stephen Douglas of Illinois was also Whig. Was a Democrat, and he was behind the compromise too. It had been opposed by John C. Calhoun, who was a Southern extremist. Obviously, he didn't get his way, as in he was virulently pro-slavery. Some people on the other side, like William Henry Seward, who was a Whig from a northern state, he'd been against the 1850 Compromise because he thought it gave away too much. It seemed to copper fasten slavery as he saw it. And some people also objected to slave power, not just slavery itself, but the way this immoral body of people were managing to wield so much power over the United States. However, things were still not settled. There was still much dispute about Kansas and Missouri and new territories in the West that might be absorbed into the United States. Would they join the US as free states or slave states? Because that could change the balance of power in the Senate. Remember, 2 senators per state, regardless of the population of that state. And there are a number of representatives for each state in the House of Representatives. The number of representatives is according to the population of the state. What was I going to say? And remember that Congress comprises the Senate and the House of Representatives. Some people wanted to abolish slavery as a federal law, as in all states. Others argued, no, it's a property issue. This is a state issue, not a federal one. Constitutional change could abolish slavery, but that was very difficult to do. It required a 2/3 majority in both the House of Representatives and the Senate, and to be signed by the President. So that's why getting a constitutional amendment to outlaw slavery was a very tall order, and that's why it didn't happen at this time. So the rising tensions had abated for a while. There was a bit of a détente in the early 1850s, but as we'll see, things flared up a little bit over this issue of expansion to the West and the admission of more states, as some Southern whites moved west, taking African Americans in servitude with them, and some Northern abolitionists saying, this is grossly immoral, it is savagely cruel, no, we can't have this. France, the United Kingdom, various other countries have abolished slavery because they recognize it's barbaric and black people should not be treated with such sadism. And Southerners tried to defend it, saying it's civilized, it's allowed, the Bible says it's acceptable, and some people publishing anti-Tom novels, as they said, which were novels against Uncle Tom's Cabin, trying to show that slavery was somehow positive, as though black people liked being treated with such cruelty.